From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm a program specialist with the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please set them to silent. Thank you. I'd also like to make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center website as well as on our YouTube and iTunes channels. I encourage you to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, to view other lectures delivered by current and past Kluge scholars. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, and Ph.D. candidates to conduct research in the library's collections. We also offer free public lectures, such as this one, conferences, symposia, book talks, roundtables, many other programs, and we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes outstanding achievement in the humanities and social sciences. For more information about the Kluge Center, please do visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge. I also invite you to sign up for our email alerts, and you will learn about future programs, and you will also learn about opportunities for you to conduct your own research here at the library. Today's program is titled Making Patriotic Prostitutes, the South Korean Government's Policies on Prostitution for the U.S. Military. It features scholar Jeong-Mi Park, currently a Kluge Fellow at the John W. Kluge Center. Dr. Park's research at the library examines how the South Korean government controlled military prostitutes catering to American servicemen in the context of U.S. military occupation, the hot and cold wars, economic development, and globalization. She also reveals the ways in which the Korean government strove to make these quote-unquote dangerous women into quote-unquote patriotic subjects who could contribute to national security. Jeong-Mi Park earned her BA, MA, and Ph.D. at the Department of Sociology, Seoul National University. She worked as a research assistant professor at Hanyang University. As a historical sociologist, she has analyzed the historical transformations of state policies, citizenship, and social movements in South Korea from the perspective of gender and sexuality. The title of her PhD dissertation is A Study on Prostitution Policies in Korea, the Transformation of a Toleration Regulation Regime and the Historical Constitution of the Prostitute, 1945 to 2005. She has published several papers in Women's Studies International Forum, Korean Journal of Sociology, and Society and History, and most recently, she has been a Kluge Fellow here at the Library of Congress. So please join me in welcoming Jeong-Mi Park.
Thank you everyone for coming to my talk. It was my honor to conduct research at the Library of Congress as a Kluge Fellow, and I would like to express my appreciation to the people who made my stay amazing. The director of the Kluge Center, Janice Hyde, the former director, Robert Galuch, and the wonderful staff such as Mary Lou, Joanne, Travis, Jason, and Dan. My colleague, Kluge Fellows, the promising young scholars, outstanding senior scholars, and many devoted librarians. And I also appreciate my husband, Jiwon, and my friend Ken for their valuable discussions. My book project is a historical sociology of prostitution policies in post-colonial South Korea. After World War II, Korea's sex industry was divided according to the race or nationality of the clients, such as Korean nationals, American troops, and foreign tourists, most of whom were Japanese. In order to control those racially segregated sex industries, the Korean government implemented separate but similar policies. In my book, I'm exploring how such policies were intertwined with Korea's ongoing nation-building process. Today, I will focus on one of those policies, the evolution of the Korean government control of prostitution for the US military since World War II, and the way in which it was developed and enforced in the name of national security. I'd like to begin my talk with a comment made by an American medical officer who visited South Korea right after World War II. He was Brigadier General Crawford F. Sams, an advisor for health and welfare to the US Army forces in South Korea. In his autobiography entitled Medic, he recalled his first impression of the Korean people, and I quote, "Korean women, as a matter of national pride, apparently had refrained from social and sexual contacts with their occupiers during the 40 years of Japanese occupation. When the American soldiers moved into Korea in the fall of 1945, the Korean girls would have nothing to do with them. In fact, the first girls who were seen in the company of American soldiers were stoned by the Korean people, who had protected their women from sexual contact with the Japanese for so many years," unquote. On one hand, Sam's observation was accurate, since Korean women's sexuality had been considered a matter of national pride and strictly suppressed for a long time. On the other hand, Sams was wrong in that the Korean people had failed to protect their women, although they despised those who catered to their occupiers. In fact, in the late 19th century, Japanese settlers transplanted a system of legalized prostitution to the Korean peninsula. Before this, prostitution in Korea had been prohibited by the Joseon dynasty, though it was not always successfully enforced. With prostitution legalized, some disenfranchised Korean girls and women were legally or illegally trafficked to brothels to serve both Japanese and Korean men. This picture shows the first brothel district in Seoul in the 1910s. The next one shows the inside of a brothel in Gunsan in the 1930s. What is worse, from 1931, when Japan invaded North China, numerous girls and women from throughout East Asia were mobilized by force and/or misrepresentation into serving as comfort women for the Japanese military. How many women were recruited is not clear. Scholars speculate that their numbers were between 50,000 to 200,000, and Korean women constituted a substantial part of them. These pictures show Korean comfort women who were rescued by the Allied forces. At the time that Sams visited Korea, a new and different chapter of Korean females' sexual contact with foreigners was about to begin. Let's go back to Sam's memoir. He continued, quote, "Time passed. With the usual gifts of candy and other things, the initial resistance of Korean women to association with foreign soldiers was broken down. A comparatively small segment of the Korean population then became highly infected, as far as venereal disease is concerned, by the American soldiers, and in turn passed the infection onto other soldiers. It does not take long," unquote. Although Sams did not mention the word explicitly, these women associating with American servicemen were deemed to be prostitutes by both Korean society and the US military in Korea. Then, how did the newly arrived foreign troops grapple with prostitution and STDs? What kind of policies did they rely on? In order to answer this question, it is necessary to go over the two legacies that had an impact on post-colonial Korea's prostitution policies: Colonial Regulation and American Prohibition. As I said before, Japanese settlers started legalized prostitution in Korea. In 1916, the colonial government promulgated a series of regulations to standardize prostitution nationwide, which were entitled Regulation of Brothel Owners and Prostitutes and Regulation of Geishas, Barmaids, and Employers of Geishas. The first regulation legalized prostitution by registering prostitutes and subjecting them to STD examinations. These licensed prostitutes were called public prostitutes. The second regulation applied to geishas, in Korean, giseng, and barmaids. In 1937, another category was added, waitresses. These women were not public prostitutes. So, in principle, prostitution among these groups was prohibited by law. Nevertheless, the colonial government also enforced the registration and STD testing of such women on the premise that they were likely to engage in prostitution. In this way, the prostitution policies in colonial Korea were composed of two pillars. I call the first one the authorization regulation policy, and the second one, the toleration regulation policy. The Japanese military's comfort station system before and during World War II was an extreme form of this authorization regulation in that the Japanese military and imperial government not only established and managed comfort stations for its servicemen, but also organized the mobilization of comfort women. In contrast, the United States adopted the opposite approach towards prostitution in the early 20th century, that is, prohibition. As this map shows, by 1942, all states except for the four shown in white had laws against prostitution. In addition, in 1941, the federal government enacted the so-called May Act to suppress prostitution near military bases. At the same time, the United States implemented extensive STD control policies, in particular during the two world wars. Women, including professional prostitutes and so-called amateurs, were considered a source of STDs. As you can see from these posters for the US military, venereal diseases were represented with demonized female figures. Military police and public health officials had authority to identify, locate, and apprehend women who were suspected of transmitting STDs to military personnel. This was called a contact tracing program. This picture shows a contact tracing interview between a military medical officer and an infected serviceman during World War II. The arrested women were incarcerated in detention centers for weeks or even months until they were cured. This photo shows a detention center during World War II, which was called a rapid treatment center. By contrast, from 1944, infected soldiers did not receive any disciplinary actions or punishment. In this respect, despite substantial differences, not only colonial regulation, but also American prohibition was a form of oppression of women, in that both of them regarded women, not men, as a source of STDs, and strictly controlled the women. And post-colonial Korea became a stage on which these two policies encountered each other. 2 days after the US Army's occupation of Korea on September 8, 1945, the United States Army military government in Korea was established. The new military government struggled to safeguard its servicemen from STDs. In May 1946, it proclaimed an ordinance to punish women with STDs for, quote, engaging in or soliciting sexual intercourse with any member of the occupying forces, unquote. What is interesting here is that the US military government in Korea, unlike in the United States, criminalized not prostitution, but the spread of STDs. Edward Grant Mead, an officer of the US military government in Korea, pointed out this contradictory nature of the prostitution policy as follows, quote, in a sense, the attitude of military government toward this profession had an amusing facet. No attempt was made to illegalize the practice, and a Korean prostitute was not disobeying the law unless she engaged in sexual intercourse with any member of the occupying forces, while, quote, suffering from a venereal disease in an infectious stage, unquote. At the same time, the military government retained the colonial requirement of registration and testing. As this document shows, quote, a policy has been set up that all entertainment girls will be required to have vaginal and serological examinations every month. Failure to have such examinations will result in the loss of license, unquote. On the contrary, Korean feminists struggled to abolish the colonial regulation. For many Koreans, state-regulated prostitution was a symbolic reminder of a shameful colonial past. In early 1947, female activists proposed a bill entitled Act on the Abolishment of Legalized Prostitution. The legislature passed it with only one dissenting vote, showing its agreement with feminists that abolition stood for a new nation free of colonial vestiges. Following the American model, the new law prohibited prostitution, criminalizing all participants in the sex industry. It is ironic that American prohibition was introduced not by the US military government, but by the Korean people who were striving to eliminate colonial vestiges. As a result of this new law, public prostitutes lost their legal status and were subject to punishment if they persisted in their work. Nevertheless, this new law was not enough to uproot all colonial vestiges, since it only abolished regulation of public prostitutes, leaving intact regulation of geishas, barmaids, and waitresses. Moreover, 2 weeks before the effective date of the new law, the military government enacted a regulation called Established Rule on the Business of Entertainers, reiterating the colonial regulation of geishas, barmaids, and waitresses who are simply recategorized as entertainers. This rule continued the registration and testing requirements. Consequently, even though prostitution was entirely prohibited by the new law, these female service workers were still subject to regulation on the assumption that they were likely to engage in prostitution, as in the colonial period. In this way, toleration regulation survived liberation and was renewed, while authorization regulation was abolished by the new prohibitionist law. I call the combination of colonial regulation and American prohibition the toleration regulation regime. Interestingly, Korean feminists did not challenge this toleration regulation regime, even though it retained the colonial legacy. Rather, they actually supported it. On one hand, they adhered to prohibition in order to build a moral nation. On the other hand, they also demanded more rigorous STD testing of women likely to engage in prostitution in order to protect the new nation from STDs. In this respect, the toleration regulation regime was more than a lingering colonial legacy. It was a post-colonial reinvention that enabled a compromise between Korean feminists and the US military government. They shared the interest of combating STDs for their nation and for their servicemen, respectively. After the Korean government was established in 1948, the US military withdrew from Korea, leaving only 500 military advisors. At the time of the Korean War, however, foreign troops, including Americans, returned, and prostitution for them resumed. During the Korean War, the peak strength of UN forces from 21 countries was 340,000, of which the vast majority, 300,000, were Americans. In order to comfort these allies, the Korean government permitted comfort stations to be established. According to one document I found at the Korean National Archives, in October 1951, the Ministry of Health instructed its officials to license comfort stations. This document specified that the purpose of such facilities was to protect the Korean people's safety, and ordered that the service be offered only to UN forces, not to civilians. It also stipulated the registration of comfort women, dancers, and waitresses in order to conduct periodic STD testing. The category of comfort women was defined as, quote, women who comfort and entertain foreign troops at comfort stations. In this way, the Korean government returned to authorization regulation during the war. Nonetheless, it was keenly aware that licensing military brothels was a violation of its own law. In this document, the Korean government instructed its officials to keep in mind that a comfort station is, quote, a special business for conducting this war, not a lawful one, unquote. UN forces cooperated with the Korean government policy as well. According to the same document, a comfort station was established when UN forces demanded it, and the UN military police assisted the Korean police in arresting women who evaded registration and STD testing. Moreover, in a document of UNCACK or UN Civil Assistance Command Korea, similar categories of women appeared as the targets of registration and STD testing: prostitutes, dancers, and waitresses. UNCACK was responsible for directing and assisting the Korean government in enforcing public health policies during the Korean War, including the prevention of STDs. Therefore, it is possible that the word prostitutes in this document was an English translation of Korean comfort women, 위안부. The frequency of checkups was twice a week for prostitutes, once a week for dancers, and once a month for waitresses. In this document, the UNCACK stipulated that, quote, if necessary, the American medical police will help the South Korean police in conducting this operation, unquote. As we already know, the terms comfort stations and comfort women originated from the Japanese military sexual slavery before and during World War II. Korean government officials used the same terms to refer to prostitutes and military brothels for UN forces. They also shared with the Japanese the idea that it was necessary to provide safe sex to the military in order to boost soldiers' morale, prevent STDs, and protect so-called ordinary women from sexual assault. In a sense, it is not surprising given the fact that the Korean War broke out only 5 years after World War II ended, and that most Korean government officials, having been trained under colonial rule, were familiar with the Japanese policies. However, historical documents indicate that the comfort stations for UN troops were established and managed in a in a manner somewhat different from the Japanese ones. First, the Japanese military directly established and managed comfort stations or ordered civilians to establish and manage them following its regulations. According to this document produced by the Allied forces right after World War II, which was entitled Amenities in the Japanese Armed Forces, such military regulation on comfort stations were meticulous, specifying almost everything, ranging from rates to service hours to terms of employment of comfort women. Civilian managers were forced to submit monthly business reports to the military and were not able to shut down their business without permission. In this respect, the Japanese comfort stations were de facto military facilities directly controlled by the Japanese military. In fact, they were often called, quote, field army canteens, unquote. In contrast, the Korean government's regulation of comfort stations was much simpler and looser, requiring only licensing the facility and registration and STD testing of comfort women. In short, the Japanese comfort stations were operated according to strict military standards, while the Korean comfort stations were in between military facilities and civilian brothels. Another important difference is that while the Japanese government and military were involved in the recruitment and transfer of comfort women, there is no evidence so far that shows that the Korean government or UN forces did the same. Finally, the scale of comfort women for UN troops was far smaller than those for Japanese military. Most researchers estimate their number between 50,000 to over 200,000. By contrast, according to the UNCK document, right after the Korean War, the number of registered prostitutes was 9,233. It can be assumed that these differences between the Japanese and Korean comfort stations resulted from the characteristics of each war and each government. The history of the Japanese military comfort stations traces back to Japan's invasion of North China in 1931, continuing until the end of World War II. The number of the Japanese military reached 3 million across the Pacific right before the end of the war. By contrast, as I previously noted, the peak strength of UN forces during the Korean War was 340,000. That was about a tenth of the Japanese counterpart during World War II. The Korean government, which was newly established in 1948 and soon thereafter devastated by the war, was much weaker and more chaotic than the Japanese imperial government. In addition, unlike in Imperial Japan, prostitution was outlawed in post-colonial Korea. Therefore, it might have been difficult for the Korean government to overtly mobilize its own women into comfort stations. These pictures show brothels or so-called houses of ill repute established during the Korean War. Considering that these houses were set up inside the Pacific Command area and that their signs were written in English, they appeared to be comfort stations for UN forces. Such a brothel was equipped with a waiting room and several bedrooms with numbered doors. This picture shows a Korean doctor examining a group of prostitutes at a field clinic that belonged to the 3rd U.S. Infantry Division. In a letter sent to UNCACK in 1951, the chief of Korean police explained the purpose of STD testing of prostitutes and other female entertainers as follows. This medical examination and medical treatment for those who need such assistance will be enforced in order to promote the efforts of the UN forces gallantly fighting this war of aggression. No misunderstanding should therefore arise from such action taken by the police, unquote. This letter implies that the Korean police considered it necessary to protect the health of the UN forces and possibly to provide safe pleasure to them to help win the war. However, the UN forces did not seem to be fully satisfied with the Korean government's STD control. In the view of the UNCACK, there was a glaring weakness in the STD policy during the war, that is, quote, the failure to isolate infected individuals until non-infectious. Prostitutes return to work immediately after examination, unquote. In order to overcome this shortcoming, facilities to isolate and treat infected prostitutes were established not long after the war. The Korean War ended in 1953, but the US, motivated by the Cold War desire to contain communism, maintained a sizable presence in Korea. While the US military operated under the name of the UN Command, all the other UN members withdrew in the 1950s and 60s. The number of American military personnel decreased from around 300,000 right after the war to 58,000 in 1961, and this level continued throughout the 1960s. The Korean government absolutely depended on the US military for its national security and was ready to do anything to meet its allies' requirements. With the US military's long-term presence, so-called camp towns, which means business and amusement area around the US military bases, started to form. These pictures show what the camp towns looked like in their early days. The images of bustling streets, clubs which the provost marshal permitted his soldiers to enter, the inside of such club, and the women who frequented these places. During the Korean War, the government was able to justify establishing comfort stations in the name of the state of emergency. However, since the comfort stations obviously violated the existing law prohibiting prostitution, the government had to shut down those facilities right after the war. Replacing the comfort stations, clubs became the main venue of prostitution. The Korean government also licensed and regulated these clubs, calling them, quote, special restaurants for UN troops, unquote. With this euphemistic term, the Korean government attempted to avoid the allegation of permitting prostitution. In this way, after the Korean War, the government returned to the toleration regulation regime, officially prohibiting prostitution, but simultaneously tolerating and regulating it. And during the Cold War, the toleration regulation regime became more systematized. It was composed of several elements. The first element was zoning. Camp towns were segregated areas for the exclusive use of American servicemen. As this picture shows, Koreans, other than those catering to the US military, were not allowed to enter these clubs. The second was registration. The Korean government registered individual prostitutes and issued certificates to them. This certificate functioned as a kind of ID card for so-called entertainers to prove that they were registered and got regular STD checkups. As during the Korean War, entertainers were classified into three groups: comfort women, dancers, and waitresses. In this way, the legal category of comfort women survived, while comfort stations disappeared. In the 1970s, the term comfort women was replaced by, quote, special business girls, unquote. All entertainers were forced to put their photos on the certificates to get the certificate stamped when they got examinations and to carry it while working. Korean government statistics indicate that as many as 10,000 women may have engaged in prostitution for the US military annually between the end of the Korean War and the late 1980s. The third was regular STD testing. The frequency of examination was the same as during the Korean War: twice a week for comfort women, once a week for dancers, and once a month for waitresses. These three elements of zoning, registration, and STD testing were carried over from Colonial Regulation. Added to this were the following three elements taken from American Prohibition. The first was the contact tracing program. From the post-World War II occupation until the Korean War, the US military tried to implement this program that it had utilized in its own country. However, this contact tracing program was initially unsuccessful due to the lack of effective enforcement. After the Korean War, the contact tracing program was stepped up. This is an excerpt from a 1955 document of the 8th U.S. Army, which describes how the program was carried out. But if the contact lives in a nearby area, appropriate military police authorities will be notified, and they, accompanied by national police, will endeavor to locate the contact and have her examined and treated, unquote. In this way, the contact tracing program was implemented jointly by the US military police and the Korean National Police. The women who were suspected of spreading infection to American servicemen or who did not carry their health certificates were arrested. The next element was forced treatment. We saw that the UNCACK recognized the lack of facilities for mandatory treatment as a glaring weakness in STD control during the Korean War. This problem was solved with the establishment of STD treatment centers in camp towns during the 1960s. It is noteworthy that in the United States, such facilities were entirely closed in the early 1950s, while they were newly set up in Korea during the 1960s. This is one of them, which was established in the 1960s and shut down in the late 1990s. The US military helped the Korean government build and manage these facilities by offering financial and medical resources. The final element was prohibition. As I previously noted, the Korean government restored prohibition right after the Korean War. This prohibition was based on the Act on the Abolishment of Legalized Prostitution, enacted in 1947, and the Act on the Prevention of Morally Degrading Behaviors, which replaced the former act in 1961. Since prostitution was legally prohibited, the Korean police had authority to round up prostitutes. But in general, the police focused not on suppressing prostitution, but on combating STDs. In this way, the toleration regulation regime that was systematized during the Cold War was a patchwork of colonial regulation and American prohibition. As a result, prostitutes were subject not only to zoning, registration, and STD testing, but also to contact tracing program, forced treatment in detention centers, and sporadic crackdowns by the police. Therefore, the toleration regulation regime can be considered one of the most severe and intensive policies vis-à-vis prostitution by combining every oppressive element of both colonial regulation and American prohibition. The testimony of former military prostitutes shows how harsh the toleration regulation regime was. This is the autobiography of Yeon Ja-kim, who sexually served the US military during the 1960s and 70s and later became a human rights activist. This is what she said as translated by me. Quote, "At that time, I did not know that Korea prohibited prostitution. After a few years, I was so surprised to learn that. Isn't it quite contradictory that the government prohibits prostitution, but at the same time forcibly examines prostitutes and prevents those with STDs from working? I have also been arrested and detained at a police station and subjected to summary trial. Women who contracted gonorrhea or other diseases were immediately sent to a detention center in June, a village surrounded by mountains. It was called Monkey House. Every woman hated living at the Monkey House. Being treated like criminals, we felt ashamed to be forced to spread our legs every day to determine whether we were diseased or not," unquote. This testimony shows that the police rounded up prostitutes not for the suppression of prostitution, but for the control of STDs, even though the prohibitionist law justified the roundups. It also demonstrates that the human rights of the women detained at the STD detention treatment centers were severely violated. Other former military prostitutes also testified that forced treatment in detention centers was painful, even causing death due to penicillin shock. The contact tracing program and forced treatment were so mercilessly carried out that its subjects were terrorized. For instance, if an American soldier pointed out a woman as a carrier of STDs, she was immediately apprehended and incarcerated at detention center, regardless of whether or not she actually infected him. The Korean officials and Camptown women often call the roundups mop up, which means clearing the enemies. In Korean, sotang. Then, how was the Korean government able to implement the two seemingly contradictory policies of prohibition and regulation simultaneously in the form of the toleration regulation regime? In fact, prohibition was based on laws that were passed by the legislature, while regulation was implemented through rules, orders, and local ordinances that the administrators could enact without the legislature's ratification. In this system, regulation overwhelmed prohibition, and in turn, both regulation and prohibition suspended basic rights guaranteed by the Constitution, such as arrest warrants, the right to legal counsel, and the right to trial. The Korean Constitution specifies that the restriction of personal freedom should be based on law. Therefore, in principle, the STD control in the Camptowns violated the Constitution. Borrowing from the Italian political philosopher Giorgio Agamben, I think this legal structure can be conceptualized as a state of exception in that it represents the undercutting of laws by executive actions, causing disturbance in the hierarchy of laws and regulations. Under this regime, the Korean government attempted to make military prostitutes into submissive bodies who offered safe sex to its most powerful ally. In addition, the government tried to indoctrinate these women with patriotism through a series of lectures by its officials, which was called patriotism education. Yeonja-kim describes such a lecture as follows, quote, "The lecturers were community leaders and the county's welfare department officials. Speaking into the microphone, all of them regurgitated the same verbiage, quote, ahem, you are patriots. Please have courage and pride, and do not forget that you are contributing to obtaining dollars. American soldiers came here to help our country. So please be decently dressed for them and do not use such vulgar slang. Today, we invited a famous English teacher. Please study hard, unquote. In 1971, the chief of police of the Yongsan district of Seoul and the commander of the U.S. military in Yongsan jointly issued a flyer to the prostitutes to deal with racial tension in camp towns, repeating the same patriotic theme. This flyer stated as follows, quote, "We believe that you have been offering the U.S. military the best service so far, but in some cases, you might have hurt some soldiers' feelings unintentionally. Let's reflect on such behavior and correct it. You have to know that the enemy is taking advantage of even trivial incidents. In the same vein, you could help the enemy unknowingly, and as a result of that, the national security could be undermined. Please keep in mind that the U.S. military came to Korea to help defend us from North Korea's aggression and destruction. Not only for your business, but also for national security, please cooperate with us in solving current problems. We encourage you to serve all American servicemen equally," unquote. The toleration regulation regime continued without challenge for almost 40 years. The first challenge came from the increase in immigration in the late 1990s. As Korea's economic development led to the depreciation of the dollar, serving American military personnel became a less lucrative option for Korean women. As a result, to fill vacancies, club owners started to import foreign entertainers from impoverished countries such as the Philippines and former Soviet Union. Being foreigners, these immigrant entertainers were more vulnerable to exploitation and violation of their rights than their Korean counterparts. Thus, Camptown became notorious for international human trafficking. In 2001, the U.S. Department of State published the Trafficking in Persons report, which ranked Korea among the most heavily trafficked countries. As a result of the report, the Korean government was faced with significant international pressure to reduce trafficking. The Korean government immediately rebutted this report, but at the same time, it acknowledged the need to combat human trafficking. Second, the growth of women's movement, which accompanied Korea's democratization, also contributed to changes in prostitution policies. In 2004, Korean feminists succeeded in enacting more stringent laws prohibiting prostitution, making toleration lose ground. Registration, STD testing, and mandatory treatment, which were based on tolerating prostitution, entirely ceased. Finally, the toleration regulation regime was replaced by complete prohibition, which remains current Korean policy. Today, I've explored the history of Korean prostitution policies for the U.S. military. Even though I showed you how oppressive the toleration regulation regime was, I do not want to depict Camptown women solely as victims. In fact, they were also brave women who fought against the injustices inflicted on them, such as government control, club owners' exploitation, and American servicemen's misconduct. I discovered many newspaper articles reporting these women's protests. And 2014, Camptown women, many of whom have now become grandmothers, started a new struggle. With the aid of feminist activists, researchers, and lawyers, they filed a lawsuit to demand reparations from the Korean government for the violation of their human rights. I hope that this suit will be an important step to vindicate their rights, and I hope that my research will shed new light on their forgotten history and contribute to coming to terms with the past. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them.
In one of the later documents that you showed, the government was remonstrating with the women that they might have hurt U.S. servicemen's feelings and that they should serve all of them equally.
Yeah.
Is this a reference to racial problems of the African American troops?
Yeah. It's actually after. It's actually after civil rights movement in United States occurred, and it influenced the Korean government policy as well. Yeah, and the clubs in Camptowns were divided according to the race. Some clubs served white soldiers, and some clubs for black soldiers. And usually the clubs for black soldiers were not so good as those for white soldiers. So there were some riots by black soldiers. Yeah, so to deal with such racial tension, the Korean government encouraged Camptown women to serve all servicemen equally.
Do you know what happened in the North, especially during the war and with Chinese troops?
Actually, I'm not aware of that because that's beyond the scope of my research. Yeah, I'm sorry. Actually, I don't think there were forced sterilization occurred in the Camptowns, but abortion was usual phenomenon, especially forced by club owners. Yeah.
Let me ask you something, specifically the relationship between the whole development of this comfort women system under the Japanese, right? And then, to a certain extent, the South Korean adapting it and taking it over via the Americans, right? Is there any, was some of these South Korean former comfort women, did they become prostitutes with Americans? Or when it happened that there was a kind of a break in it because of the background of, of identity, et cetera, or some of them transition? That's the first question. The second question is that they said that the system of this toleration regulation has come to an end. But what's the name of the guy? David Wine just wrote a book called Base Nation, in which he's making the claim that still is around the basis some measure of ongoing toleration regulation happening, and yet still have a lot of women from, for example, Philippines coming in, other places coming in, and still partaking in this type of thing. And the last question is, this whole issue of reparation, which I think is quite interesting. They are going against seemingly reparation from the South Korean government. Are they also going for reparations from the U.S. military, the U.S. government, and UN, the South government?
Yeah. All the three questions are very difficult. So I can't remember the first question, so I'm sorry, but could you repeat the first question?
The first question is the movement of comfort women from the Japanese. Did some of these women also move into the new system that was set up, or was there a complete break between the two?
Yeah. There is not enough material, but I know one woman's autobiography that she was former comfort women for the Japanese military. But after the liberation, she worked in Camptowns as well. But it was just one case I found. Yeah. But I think there might some women who persisted in so-called comforting soldiers after World War II. I mean, some former comfort women for the Japanese military continued their work, so-called their work after the liberation, because they didn't have enough means to make a living. But unfortunately, there is no evidence so far, except for that one I mentioned. And although prostitution is entirely outlawed, especially after 2004, probably there is still ongoing prostitution in Camptowns among the foreign immigrant entertainers. But there are regulations such as registration and mandatory treatment or mandatory examination entirely ceased. So I don't think it can be called toleration regulation anymore. And today I focused on the Korean government's policy, but the US military also intervened or assisted the Korean government to carry out such policies. So I think there might be some lawsuits against the US military or the United States, but I'm not sure.
So given the public pressures to prohibit prostitution after World War II, what kind of social repercussions were there for women who were working in China or as comfort women? And did the government sort of direct this patriotism discourse toward the general public as well, to sort of legitimize these women's work, or was that discourse just directed towards them?
Yeah. Korea was dominated military dictatorship for so long time. So patriotism was a kind of universal discourse, not only for Camptown women, but for ordinary citizens. But the Korean government especially emphasized these women to emphasize patriotism, to make these women so-called patriotic subjects to more effectively serve its most important allies. And one more question.
Thank you for your presentation. Really, really interesting. You showed a picture of a pregnant woman in a POW camp who was exploited for sexual labor. So when there was pregnancy, what was the status of the children who went to Fulton?
You mean during the Second World War, or?
Yeah, because we're in a situation of fathers are US, mothers Korean.
Or after the colonization, or
During the war, yeah.
During the-
World War II, Korean War,
yeah.
kids were born.
During the Second World War, Japanese military comfort stations, babies were usually abortioned. Yeah, and some fortunate women were able to give birth. Yeah. And after the liberation, many military prostitutes got married to U.S. military as well. So they had babies, but they were considered a kind of social outcast in Korea because they were called mixed blood. So many of them were actually adopted to the United States or other countries. It was a for official policy for the Korean government to so-called export those mixed. Yeah.
I think we'll stop it there. Please join me in thanking Dr. I think there's some thunder brewing, so we'll get you out of here before the thunderstorms hit. A quick final announcement, though. We are on break from our public programming for the next couple weeks, but we return August 18th with a lecture by our Kluge Chair in Countries and Cultures of the South, Dr. Juan Cole. He'll be talking about ideas of peace in the Quran, so please join us for that. If you're interested in our events, please sign our email list on the way out, and thank you again, Jeong-Mi, for a fascinating lecture.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.